As many of you know, the purpose of my channel is not just to review movies, but also to shed light on some of the more overlooked topics regarding North Korea. One of the more fascinating of which being urban legends originating from North Korea, or legends from South Korea that involve direct contact with the North in some way. The following video is a follow-up to episode 2 of the Mysteries of North Korea series titled Bulgogi GP, which I will link below in case you haven't seen it, as I recommend watching it first. In the video, I tell about a popular urban legend about a group of ROK soldiers who are violently killed by North Korean infiltrators. However, since making that video, it has since come to my attention that there are many other variations of the story that, like the original, sends chills down the spine of every fresh conscript sent to the DMZ. This is the story of the North Korean Virgin.
By any of the 100 ways the communists test the line and violate the 1953 armistice. In spite of everything, the Republic of Korea struggles to come of age. This is the story of what has happened to her since the armistice.
The year is 1966. For a South Korean conscript fresh out of boot camp, receiving orders that he is assigned to guard the DMZ is seen as a fate worse than death, as North Korea possessed a significant, measurable advantage in firepower over their southern counterparts. Every day, soldiers of the young South Korean Republic often became victims of one-sided firefights between the AK-wielding North Koreans against the heavily outgunned South Korean troops, whom in many cases were still armed with M1 Garands. This series of aggressive actions by the North became known as the DMZ conflict, which lasted from 1966 to 1969, and saw the deaths of hundreds of South Korean troops, dozens of American servicemen, as well as an unknown number of North Koreans. Paranoia and fear swept through the ranks of those unfortunate enough to have been stationed at the DMZ during this time. It is around this time period that the legend of the North Korean Virgin was born. According to legend, one night, a group of South Korean soldiers were occupying a guard post on the DMZ in the remote wilderness that makes up the Yeonggu County of Gangwon, South Korea, an area that was known as a hotspot for North Korean infiltrators due to its proximity to the city of Sokcho. Despite the rumors, their time at the guard post was relatively uneventful, aside from the occasional sighting of a woman across the DMZ, likely a civilian farmer. All was calm in the dead of the night as the soldiers enjoyed the brief respite from the terror that lied just beyond the invisible line that separated the two Koreas. The respite wouldn't last long. As the soldiers peered through the starlit night, they glimpsed a girl, and not just any girl, the kind of girl who would look good in a burlap sack, but was all dolled up even in this wretched portion of the DMZ. The harsh strictures of the ROK conscript discipline melted within seconds as they ogled her approach. Her hips swaying just so, a certain mischievous tingle in her immaculate eyes. As the saying went, women were more beautiful in the North, and this specimen was only further proof. They couldn't help but perk up further when she began speaking in a sing-song voice and inviting them to come north with her for soju, rice, and intimacy with her and her girlfriends. The South Korean men didn't have to be asked twice. They hadn't seen a woman, let alone one half as pretty, in months. The soldiers gleefully abandoned their defensive position, following the mysterious girl who almost seemed to shimmer under the moonlight into the other, more enigmatic Korea. A forewarning, however, it wouldn't end well. According to legend, as soon as all of the soldiers had crossed over, the young girl would dematerialize, vanishing before their very eyes into the tenebrous void of which she came. Not so much as a moment later, the vegetation before them would light up with the muzzle flashes of dozens of AK-47s. The sporadic rattling of assault rifles echoed from the void, ripping holes and tearing flesh through the poor South Korean soldiers who were standing in the open. Before a single soul even knew what was going on, or much less try to call for help, they were dead. Another version of the story follows the same basic premise. A A small section of 6 South Korean conscripts are holed up in a guard post in Yeonggu County late one night when a mysterious woman approaches the guard post from the north. Like in the previous version, she is young and immaculate, possessing an almost supernatural beauty. Some of the soldiers had heard rumors about North Korean women approaching South Korean guard posts before with deadly results, but they had simply dismissed them as rumors. Where this version begins to diverge is that instead of inviting the South Korean soldiers to cross the demarcation line with the promise of alcohol and sex, instead she offers to join the men in their guard post to share some drinks. The small section of about 6 soldiers are unable to resist and happily welcome the mysterious girl over, where they enjoy a night of alcohol and laughter, as well as repeated attempts at intimacy with the mysterious woman, whom they note as being cold to the touch. At some point in the not-too-distant future, another section of troops arrived at the guard post to relieve them of their position. When the staff sergeant noticed that the section he came to relieve did not come out to meet him, he began to grow worried. He approached the guard post but was immediately thrown back by the foul stench that permeated from the structure. Fearing the worst, he ordered his subordinates to cover their noses and investigate. Upon entering the structure, the soldiers were met with a horrific sight. The interior of the guard post had been blackened with flames. The floors and walls splattered with burned flesh and entrails of the 6 South Korean soldiers, whose mangled, charred remains were located squarely in the center of the guard post, surrounded by broken, melted remains of bottles of alcohol. Noticeably absent from the carnage, however, was the North Korean woman, whom local soldiers had come to dub the North Korean Virgin. There are a few different hypotheses as to the identity of the North Korean Virgin. One such story tells that she is the ghost of a radio personality for the Korean People's Army who would broadcast propaganda daily to South Korean soldiers across the DMZ in Yeonggu County. According to legend, one day a section of soldiers from the South Korean Special Warfare Command grew tired of her non-stop radio broadcasts and decided to put a stop to it. At night, the elite unit snuck across the DMZ, which in those days was a simple invisible line, and snuck their way into the radio station on the North Korean side, whereupon they broke into the broadcasting room, apprehending the woman and slitting her throat. Another story tells us that the North Korean Virgin is actually the vengeful spirit of a South Korean woman named Yang Kongju, Kongju meaning princess in Korean. Kongju was a local sex worker who lived in the nearby city of Munsan, not far away from the Yeonggu guard post. As the story goes, one day when the guard post was under the jurisdiction of forces from the United States Army, one of the U.S. Army soldiers solicited young Kongju for her services. It is said that after having his way with her, instead of paying her what he owed, he instead chose to kill Kongju and hid the remains by burning her body in an oil drum and hiding it nearby. It wasn't until the guard post was later occupied by South Korean soldiers that one of the soldiers discovered the horrific sight when opening one of the oil drums. It was from that point on that South Korean soldiers began encountering a young, beautiful woman from the north, enticing them to share drinks and intimacy with her, blissfully unaware that they were about to fall victim to the vengeful spirit of young Kongju. Ghost stories like this are not at all uncommon along the DMZ, where small sections of soldiers are stationed in remote wilderness for days at a time, with little to no interaction with others outside of the occasional North Korean patrol on the other side of the fence. As a result, it doesn't take long for a story about a pretty femme fatale North Korean girl turned vengeful spirit meant to scare the daylights out of green conscripts to take shape. Whether or not this story has any truth to it or not is difficult to verify. During the DMZ conflict, which lasted from 66 to 69, North Korea and South Korea were engaged in a literal shooting war. Daily cross-border raids and ambushes from both sides resulted in horrific casualties, and is often regarded as the Second Korean War. During this time, The Geneva Conventions were tossed to the wind as both sides would constantly search for ways in which to get the upper hand over the other. With that in mind, the idea of the North Koreans using a beautiful young woman as bait to lure a bunch of hormonally crazed kids out of their guard posts to ambush, or getting them pissed drunk and helpless against North Korean infiltrators, doesn't seem all that unlikely given the intensity of the conflict. With that said, I think it's possible that the story could be based off a kernel of truth. That truth being that there was probably an incident where South Korean soldiers encountered this trap, and over time the story was changed and manipulated through word of mouth into that of a ghost story about a vengeful spirit that was killed by a US soldier or South Korean commandos, depending on who you talk to. Just like Bulgogi GP, the story of the North Korean Virgin is still told today among troops at the DMZ. It is very likely this is a story meant to scare young conscripts, or at least teach them the importance of recognizing potential traps from the North Koreans. Whether the story is true or not, I believe it teaches us an important lesson. Always be on your guard, and if something looks too good to be true, especially if it's coming from the North, it most definitely, assuredly, is.